Welcome to the Great Language Partner podcast. I'm Katja.
And I'm Nicole. We are two neurodiversity affirming speech therapists on a mission to bring joy to your autistic child's communication journey.
Separately, we've helped hundreds of neurodivergent kids become confident communicators, but we know we can make an even bigger impact together. Whether you're a parent or professional, we're here for you as you navigate your unique journey.
We'll talk all things Gestalt language development, sensory processing, and beyond as we share practical tips and inspiring stories to help you become your child or student's greatest language partner.
Let's create a more understanding, supportive, and affirming world for autistic kids.
One conversation at a time.
Hi, Dyan. It's so exciting to have you with us. Before we dive in, can you give us a little bit of background on yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Dyan, and I'm a Canadian blogger who has two kids. And I educate people about hyperlexia. Because my son, at just before his second birthday, started to read, and it was a shock. And of course, I tried to find out, well, what's going on here? I had never heard of the word hyperlexia. I didn't know it existed until he got his autism diagnosis. And then all of a sudden I was like, wait, if I don't know about it, there's probably lots of other people who've never heard of it. So I started, writing about it on my website and blog so that, other parents like myself wouldn't be like, well, my kid can read. What do I do with this? And, to help, potential teachers and therapists who would be working with my son eventually, or other hyperlexic kids, get a better understanding of what hyperlexia is and, what it isn't.
Awesome. So like a lot of parents, your kid did this thing, and because they did this thing, you became an expert in it to support them. That's really cool.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, it's the only thing I could do. If nobody else had heard of it, I gotta, learn everything I could about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of the parents here feel the same way about Gestalt language. They are forced kind of to become well-versed in it because they can't find a therapist or professional to guide them besides maybe social media. And I'm sure parents relate to that with so many different things that they support their kids with. But you've really become a specialist, and we're excited to learn from you.
Yeah, so can you start us off a little bit by telling us what is hyperlexia and tell us about what it looked like for your son and kind of what people could look for to know if their child may be hyperlexic?
Yeah, for sure. So there are three key traits of hyperlexia. The first being the early reading ability. It is precocious, it's self-taught, and it can happen quite early. Like I mentioned, my son started reading before his second birthday. And there have been people who've mentioned that their kids are 18 months when they start reading. So it is quite young. So that's the one key trait. Another one is their language differences. Now this will be that echolalia, so Gestalt language processing, Gestalt. I always struggle saying that word. Gestalt language processing, comprehension issues. They have difficulty with expressive language and difficulty with WH questions. Then the third key difference is the social aspect. So they have difficulty with social interactions, transitions. They have a strong preference for routines, and they don't really initiate conversations. So those are kind of the three main things. Now, most hyperlexic parents parents of hyperlexic kids will notice the intense interest first, right? We're talking alphabet, numbers, logos, maps, visual patterns. It can take shapes, but usually it's letters that are first. And that's really what we noticed first is everything was about the alphabet. And all of a sudden he's teaching himself these letters, and he can read it in different fonts. And, it didn't matter if it was uppercase or lowercase. So that's kind of the first thing that these parents will notice, and then it kind of leads to that early reading ability. Some other characteristics are they have a really strong memory, especially for auditory or visual components. So, that makes sense when you think about how they learn language. It makes sense that the auditory component would be so strong, but that can also lead to things like really good musical skills and even perfect pitch too. So those are kind of the main characteristics. But like I said, it will be that intense interest in the letters first, and then it will move to that early reading ability.
Thanks for sharing some of those early signs. And I know I see those in so many of the kids I work with. And a lot of them I thought were just things that autistic kids do and things that Gestalt language processors do. Is that because hyperlexia overlaps so much in this population, or what? Why is that?
Yeah, great question. So most hyperlexic learners are also autistic. There's a research paper from 2017, I think it is, where they have noted that 84% of hyperlexic learners are autistic, or they have, several autistic features and maybe aren't identified as autistic yet. So yeah, a huge overlap. Now, not all autistic learners are going to be hyperlexic. It's more about 6 to roughly about 20% of autistic learners are hyperlexic. So yeah, there is a lot of overlap. You can kind of almost assume that if your kid's hyperlexic, they are probably going to be autistic as well. Now, as for the Gestalt language processing piece, yeah, it's hyperlexic learners are Gestalt language processors, and it makes sense when there is that huge overlap with, being autistic as well.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And I'm thinking about those statistics about how many autistic kids are hyperlexic. And I almost wonder if those numbers are low because of the fact that not every autistic child will develop speech, or maybe they have motor differences that would make it difficult to show that they can read and show that they can do these things, or that they have this interest in letters. So I'm almost wondering, because there have been some times where I've worked with a child for years and then I'm like, wait a minute, did you just read that? It's like it kind of, but there are other kids who it's very clear from the beginning that they love letters. They can, I've had kids be able to write, and I'm sure you've talked about this, or you've probably seen it in your own child, Dyan, but like they could write the logos to things like exactly how they are. And I'm like, what do you know about Target? Like, who's taking how, when did you go to Target? Do you want to go to Target? So I think those kinds of things are the clearest signs a lot of times, but that there could also be, a child or many people out there who are non-speaking who could be hyperlexic and just not have a way to really show it, which goes back to that presuming competence and kind of making sure that every child has access to robust AAC if they're non-speaking, which is another one of our favorite things to talk about. But getting back to the point, I think that number is probably low. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the problems with, the hyperlexia research is there's not a lot to go with. And the definition of hyperlexia has evolved so much. So the criteria that people have used for those research papers will vary. So sometimes they will include just strictly early self-taught reading. Some will be like, no, it has to be that early reading with the language and social differences. So the criteria has changed from the papers over the years. So it really makes the estimates probably not accurate, or at least underestimating. Like, to me, I think most, if not all, hyperlexic kids are autistic. But there isn't the research to support that yet.
Yeah, it makes sense. And what does that word precocious mean in this definition? Because I feel like we hear that all the time when it comes to hyperlexia. Like I've heard that word, but I don't think we hear it or say it in our everyday vocabulary. Can you kind of like explain what that means in terms of their comprehension, and what does that mean, precocious? To me, I've always heard it described, and maybe I'm wrong, which is kind of, I'm asking this for my own self-interest. Does that mean that they are reading well beyond like what they would understand, their comprehension skills? Does that play into it? Is that what that word means?
Yeah, so I think you could take the precocious to mean quite a few things. It's intense. It's almost compulsive, where they are just drawn to anything written. They will read everything in sight. But it is also like they will read way above what they can understand. Like, I think of it this way: if you were to read a physics textbook, you could read the words, but you might not necessarily grasp the concepts because we don't have that background knowledge of physics. Unless, of course, you do have a physics background, but I know you're a speech
No.
therapist. So something like that, it's helpful to understanding hyperlexia. It's like, yeah, they can read everything, maybe sometimes in a different language too, but they're not necessarily going to grasp, the main ideas or what some of the words might mean. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
It does for sure, because I think the reason that I've always kind of thought about that is because, like, how do we know how much they're understanding? And because when I see a kid come in who's really interested in letters and numbers and they're clearly hyperlexic, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. Always so excited by it because it's such a great interest to have, and it's such a great skill to like start working on those literacy things. But I always wonder, like, where can we or how can we support a child who is hyperlexic, um, without assuming they understand more than they do, but also while still honoring that they are very intelligent and these skills are meaningful? Because I think I've been in places where it was one extreme or the other. It was either like, yeah, they can read that, but they don't understand any of it. Like, we're not doing that. They don't understand it. It's just, stimming, or it's useless. And then I've been in other places where the child may be expected to do all of these really hard comprehension things that were just not even appropriate.
Yeah, so you touch on a lot of really interesting things, because so often people will be like, yeah, I think my kid's hyperlexic, but they understand everything. And their kid is like maybe 3. I'm like, well, think about what they're reading. It's usually maybe a picture book, like Chicka Chicka Boom Boom, for instance, is a very popular one with hyperlexic learners. But there's nothing where they have to like necessarily make inferences or try to understand the author's intention behind writing. Like that is kind of where these comprehension issues really are noticeable. And you'll start to really see them when they get to about 4th grade, because in 4th grade, that's when they switch from, reading for decoding purposes versus reading for understanding. So I like to remind parents that things might look okay now and might be fine now, but down the road when it gets, a lot more challenging and there's more task demands on them, like they have to try and interpret what words mean in the context of a sentence, or, the author's tone and all that kind of stuff, right? That's kind of where the challenges really start to happen. So I always try to remind them, like, just keep practicing those important comprehension skills so that when we get to those higher grades, it's not as big of a gap between their reading ability and the comprehension.
Oh, that's so interesting about that, like learning to read versus reading to learn, distinction that happens around that time, like 4th grade. Because I feel like that's when, in my career at least, that's when I would have the kids and I would see those, like that kind of line of like, are you understanding this? Or can you just read well beyond, your peers? But I also think, like, one thing that always was very apparent to me was like, well, maybe this is like the world's most boring book that you've given them. Like, and so that could also be the factor here, that like they're not answering these inference questions and, main character, main point, because we're not listening because this is the most boring book. You know what I mean? Like,
Exactly.
it wasn't interest based. And I think with autism, we really want to be aware of and lean into those interests. So, if you presented them with a higher reading level text about, I'm thinking of one child in particular who loved the show Super Why,
Oh,
and he could, it's like, I feel like a lot of hyperlexic kids love Super Why, but he could answer probably any question about any Super Why because he was interested in it. Now, granted, that may not be like as advanced in terms of the content, but you could certainly take those themes and like find a book at a higher grade level and present it, and he probably would have had more interest and that therefore greater ability to respond. So I feel like that was always my frustration, was that people would say yes, he can read and type and spell, but he doesn't understand that. And I'm like, I think you're just giving him the wrong content.
yeah. And I agree. Like the interest thing makes a huge difference, right? Like think about even when you read books, you're more likely to, be involved in something and enjoy it even when it's something related to something you like. Whereas if you're like, oh, I have to read this because it's, part of my job or part of, school assignment, of course, it's not going to be as interesting. So I think you raise a really good point. There's also like the difference between fiction and nonfiction, right? Like hyperlexic kids will just absorb facts. So if you're giving them, these nonfiction books, yeah, their comprehension is going to be really good because they'll spit out those facts that they read. They'll probably even tell you what page it's on. I know my son would do that. He'd be like, "Oh yeah, I learned that on page 32 in this book," and it's like, "Oh, okay, you flip. Sure enough, he's right." Whereas something like a fiction book, they might not be as interested in because it just doesn't align with their interests at all.
There's so much more of that like character development and like theme and like everything relating to one another. It's not as abstract, it's not as concrete. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
On the topic of interests, something a story that comes up a lot has come up a lot over my career is I get a new client and they tell me, yeah, my child loves letters and all they want to do is play with letters and read letter books and, alphabet, alphabet, alphabet. And the last therapist told me to hide those things, not make them available. So we don't talk about letters anymore. How do you feel about that?
I knew exactly where this question was going when you started it. It really kind of upsets me. I do not like it. I think it's terrible advice. Usually what I say is if someone has told you that advice, find a new therapist because they clearly do not understand the hyperlexic learning style at all. The thing is, like, if that interest had been dinosaurs or cars, would we be saying the same thing? No.
I think some therapists would,
Well,
but
maybe,
yeah,
but, generally, like, if it's a more, typical interest for a kid that age, they're less likely to say you need to take it away.
sure. Yeah.
The thing people don't realize is with something like the alphabet is there are literally ABC books for every topic nowadays. So you can easily expand their interest from alphabets, but still like appeal to that interest, right? Like you could go pick up an ABC book of, I don't know, I think there's some of physics and computer science and dinosaurs. Like there's
Yeah.
so
There's
many
also so many ABC toys now. I have tons of hyperlexic kids and we have robots that are alphabet letters that change into robots. We have an alphabet
Yes.
train, we have alphabet stacking blocks. Like there's so many ways to expand and play on that interest which yeah.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing I like to remind people of, like, you can take those interests and, like, combine them into so many things, right? Like, you just talked about unfolding and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
You're working on fine motor skills, right? You can take even, magnetic letters. You can put them down a slide and be like, "Wee, A is going for a slide," right? Like, there's so many ways to teach valuable skills using the alphabet that it's just, like, mind-boggling when people are like, "Oh, just take it away." Right?
And you know what? It's so interesting that you bring up the like if it was a traditionally accepted interest, like what would we do? And I recently shared about that on social media because, like Katya said, there are some people out there who would also say, no, if it's something that they're just like, quote unquote, obsessed with, we should take it away because that obsession, and I'm using that in their words, not mine, but
Right.
this obsession, this hyper focus on this toy or this category of toys is distracting. It's getting in the way of their play. And obviously all three of us in this conversation would say, no, there's nothing to be distracted from. That is the play, their interests is the play. And there's, that's a whole can of worms that I'm sure we'll get into. But I recently shared about my own like experience as a parent when my son was a toddler and he loved monster trucks. We made monster trucks our whole personalities for like 2 years. We had monster trucks coming out of our ears. Like everything was monster truck. We had his comforter was a monster truck. Like if we saw a monster truck at the store, we bought it. And Was he obsessed with monster trucks? Yeah, I would say so. But nobody even blinked an eye. They were like, oh my God, that's so cute. Here's a monster truck. We kept buying them. Why do autistic kids have to have interests that align with what everybody else likes? Like when an autistic child has interests that are letters or numbers, why don't we celebrate it like that? I mean, I know why we don't.
Oh, I
It's
think
a
we as a culture are obsessed with taking away autistic kids' joy. And
we
it's,
are.
yeah.
And we're here to break that cycle.
So,
In our little space of the internet.
yeah.
But yeah, I think that is so because one of my many of my clients, but one parent, I I shared about this recently too. I went into their house and I'm like, "Well, what does he like?" And they were like, "Well, he really likes letters." But I was like, "Oh, where are they?" Because there were no letter toys. I'm like, "Oh, let's get them out." They're like, "No, we don't have them anymore because we hid them." And I'm
Mhm.
like, "What do you mean?" And they're like, "Because the the old therapist told us that the letter toys were the reason that he wasn't developing other skills because he's so obsessed with them and they were, getting in the way. So we took them away because we don't want him to be distracted by them." I was like, "Go get the letter toys."
Yeah.
Like, please go get them and bring them out here. But there's so much of that advice still out there that I think we forget about.
It's unfortunate that so many parents are steered in wrong directions because they trust the professionals that, they are taught to trust. They should be able to trust us to guide them in the right ways. But I mean, we're all doing the best we can. But that's definitely a
Did
piece of advice that is not
did
good.
you have that experience, Diane, when your
So
son was going through?
we thankfully never had anyone say that to us. And it's something that, I started hearing about more once I started sharing about it online and, connecting with other families. They're like, our therapist told us this. I'm like, why? Why would they do this? Like hyperlexic kids use the ABCs to regulate. It can be such a great coping mechanism for them. So not only are you taking away their joy, like Katja said, but you're also like taking away some coping skills for them. Now, I do want to say I totally understand why some parents might think, okay, this isn't terrible advice because those
Yes.
toddler and preschool years are incredibly, incredibly intense. When they're in the height of that hyperlexia, quote unquote obsession, it's intense because it's all day, every day, and everywhere you turn, there is letters everywhere, right? Just like there's numbers everywhere. Like I still remember going for a walk with my son and he's like, "Oh, 14 or whatever the number was." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" I look up and the street lamps have numbers. Like I would have never noticed that. But
Oh my
there
gosh.
yeah. So, like, I can understand why parents would be like, okay, well, let's try this out because it is consuming so much of our day and we don't seem to be doing anything else. But I think parents just need to take a deep breath and realize, no, this is bringing my child joy. This is what they do to regulate their bodies. This is how I can connect with my kid versus being like, yeah, let's just take all that away.
Yeah, but thank you for validating that because I think that is really important that it does often feel all encompassing and it can pose challenges as well if a child, especially when we get into this kind of gestalt thinking, like if there's a letter missing in their set or if they can't complete this idea around
Yes.
their alphabet play, that it can cause meltdowns. It can be really dysregulating. And yeah, it's valid that we might think about how we can move away from that. But when it comes to supporting these kids, obviously a big one is really diving into their interest of letters and alphabet. Do you have any other like quick tips for parents or therapists to support this hyperlexic style of learning?
Yeah, so the other big one is to use the fact that they can read and start writing down everything. Make everything
Mm,
visual as possible.
yes.
It's one thing to say like, "Go get your shoes," but it's a completely different thing to have a visual that says, "Okay, I need shoes, I need my coat, I need my backpack," or whatever, right? Like it's all written down. So that's my biggest thing is write it down. Doesn't matter what it is or how silly it seems, it will make such a huge difference. for supporting your hyperlexic learner.
Yes, I've been recently really like making sure to explicitly give examples of that to the parents who come here whose kids are hyperlexic because, I think it sounds like an extra step for parents. Like when I'm like, okay, well, we'll write things down. But then I show them like it does not have to be like this whole thought out thing. It's like I literally will have like a piece of paper or a whiteboard in my hand and I just write. Now I use an app on my iPad that I just write on there, whatever it is that I want to say. And sometimes it's helpful when we're trying to like understand a transition or there's like other competing factors because like when things are, for example, really exciting, like if the child really wants to go to Target, well, it's 5 o'clock in the morning and Target's not open, I might write something down that says like, I'm going to Target at 9 o'clock, like something like that, just to, and a hyperlexic kid will often really like that because they can then sit and read it and look at it and it's like in their own language, so to speak. But I tell parents like just let them see everything that you're writing too. Just have that available to them. But yeah, absolutely to like give them directions and information by writing them down on a whiteboard or however, even texting on your phone, like in the notes app, typing it on your phone. I've seen that be so effective and it's so simple. Like it can sometimes be just what they need to like understand or regulate in that moment.
Going back to your comment about it doesn't need to be fancy, like you can literally take a sticky note and just quickly write down a message. My son, like he's going to be 15 right away. He still carries his boogie board with him like everywhere because he'll just quickly scribble things down. He also just likes to doodle. So it can be anything. Like you said, an app on your phone, it can be texting them. It can be whiteboard. I mean, we have whiteboards all over the house for that reason. But yeah, boogie board for if you're on the go. And yeah, just take that 2 to 3 seconds to write something down just really makes a huge difference.
I also love writing out Gestalt models and adding that visual component to Gestalt language focused therapy for these kids that respond well to that. So again, going to that whiteboard and just writing down the phrase that you're modeling oftentimes makes it stick a bit more for these kids. And yeah, like you said, it could be so simple to add those supports.
And sometimes I think like parents have been told by professionals that their child's like I've had a lot of parents come and say like, I feel like they're reading because, they see this word in a book and then they go get that object. And I'm like, yeah, they are reading. Your intuition or your observation is accurate because there are a lot of people out there who will say to the parents like, no, they're not reading. Like, maybe they memorize that one word, like they sort of downplay it. So I also think I love when I tell a parent to start writing things down like that. And then they come back the next week and they're like, oh my gosh, they understand so much more than I realized. And it could be such a great, like a powerful moment for parents to be like, oh my gosh, like I didn't even realize how much they could read. And I'll do that here too. If I suspect the child is really interested in letters and numbers, or I believe that they're hyperlexic, I'll just start writing things down just like while we're playing for fun. And like 9 out of 10 times they're like running over to the board like, oh my gosh, like they're so excited. I have like the letter stickers, I have magnets, like you lean into it and that like that can make a huge difference. But it also I think is reassuring for parents who may have otherwise not known this about their child.
And Nicole, you mentioned your example of some random child who recognized a word and somehow showed that they recognized that word. And it reminded me of a question for Dyan that I was curious about. Do you find that these early hyperlexic kids are more so memorizing sight words versus decoding? Because I find that a lot of my just generally autistic kids, like that's how they seem to learn to read and learn literacy is really they're strong in memorizing sight words. And then when it comes to decoding, like actually sounding out, knowing the sounds for each letter and taking it apart that way or building it that way, it's a little bit trickier. Does that go for hyperlexia as well? Or are they stronger in the decoding?
Yeah, so this is a great question. There's a little bit of research that talks about this where they kind of learn to read so fast that they kind of just go through the stages so quickly or they skip over them. And unfortunately, phonics is one of those stages that they just kind of zip through and they don't
Mhm.
necessarily learn on their own. So it's still important to teach them phonics so that when they get to a word they've never seen before, they know how to decode it. Now, having said that, there is some research that shows that hyperlexic readers can read anything, even if it's nonsense words, they'll decode it. So you can't say it's memorizing in that case, right? Because it's sometimes a word that, A, doesn't exist and B, they've never seen before. But they will like kind of gravitate towards like the patterns. They can start to pick up on those words. So they might see a word, for instance, that starts with, I don't know, for some reason I have the word chicken in my head. So chicken. So they might see the CHIC and just automatically it's chicken. But if they come across another word that starts with that same, they might be like, oh, that's also chicken.
I see
Which,
that a lot, yeah.
yeah. So sometimes they are just relying on this, memory piece because, and the pattern skills are, they're just like, oh, I've seen that pattern before and that was chicken last time. So this one might be chicken. But I find like in my son's case, it didn't matter what I put in front of him. He was reading it. But some of the pronunciation would be a little bit off because the phonics wasn't there. Like I think of the word like psychologist when he tried to read that. Like he got a little tongue tied trying to get all those sounds out. So yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it doesn't seem like there's a really straightforward, answer to it.
Yeah, that's kind of what I figured. So I get asked a lot about just literacy and Gestalt language. How do we specifically teach Gestalt language processors how to read? And there's not research on that overlap, but we do have research on hyperlexia, which is pretty much encompassing autistic kids pretty much primarily in that research. So we can go off of some of those things. But yeah, it doesn't seem like we have really cut and dry answers for that. So I usually just tell people that oftentimes autistic kids are more drawn to sight words and have strength in identifying sight words, and the decoding can be harder, but we still want to teach them that phonics piece. And sounds like you agree with that.
Speaking of that phonics piece, are there certain programs
Mhm.
or ways to teach these skills that you have seen be more effective versus others? Maybe they're not specific programs, but I think about when I worked in the schools and had many autistic kids on my caseload who were, I hate to say this, but at the time it was like some kids were this sounds horrible, and this was just a few years ago. Some kids were like candidates for reading support, almost as if like they had to demonstrate that they had some capacity, which is outrageous to me. But before they could then get that kind of instruction, otherwise they were kind of put into the camp of like sight words and sight words
Oh my
only.
god, don't get me started on that.
Like I'm like,
Yeah.
ooh, I hate to do this to us, but and then those kids never got the instruction. They got, here's your sight words you're going to memorize and we'll see you later. And so they were never even given a chance. And then you'd put a device in front of some of those kids and they could type, you know, these things, like they could type the exact YouTube name from their favorite episode. I'm like, you need to be getting reading instruction so that we understand what you need support with. But I guess like in the places where I've worked, they would be like, well, we don't really have a great program for this kid. And I'm like, that's not a good enough answer for me. So are there certain programs that are going to be better for others?
Yeah, see, I don't know. I think the best thing you can do is just kind of use the knowledge you have about how they learn and their interests and kind of play off that. So thankfully, we live in the age of the internet where we have Google at our fingertips and YouTube at our fingertips. So you can find lots of really engaging like phonics videos on YouTube that, they'll have no problem like getting into because it's just
I
letters
love it.
screen, right? Like, so use that and, just, yeah, this also falls on the shoulders of educators at school too, right? To be teaching and keeping in mind how they learn. And, maybe we have to write down specific rules for them. If you see these letters together, it makes, this sound, right? Like you can explicitly write those things out. Because sometimes when we're teaching kids, we'll just be like, oh yeah, this means this, but they don't really explain the why or how they got there. And sometimes our hyperlexic kids really need, that explained to them.
Facts.
Yeah. So
That's a
I
great
don't,
point.
I have no experience with like teaching phonics. So I can't like add anything to that or talk about specific programs, but that's just
But it
kind of,
needs to be done.
yeah, it's one of those things you can't ignore. You just can't assume that, yes, they can read. So therefore they must be good at everything. Let's put all these unrealistic expectations on them, right? It's unrealistic to do that. You have to keep in mind that, okay, because they're hyperlexic, there could be some comprehension issues. So we might have to prepare for this. They may have fast tracked through phonics. So let's still teach them that, even if they do know some of that, right? Like it's just good to reinforce that in case there was anything that was missed. Because like I said, it just happens so fast and so spontaneously that there's no way that they can possibly have learned all of that on their own, right?
And I guess it's a lot of it is not necessarily down to one particular program or system. Like you said, obviously that's best practice for everything, but really understanding how your unique student or child learns and then presenting it that way, which, listen, we understand that it's not always realistic when you're in a classroom of 10 kids and everybody's learning differently, but there are some things that are going to be more powerful and more effective than others. I'm thinking of things like making it multimodal, having it a visual component, like a musical component, having some kind of sensory component. Oh, we're finding letters in the sensory bin and not making it so boring. Like I think sometimes when we think about these academic skills, we just think like, oh, well, we'll just teach it and we'll do our worksheets and that's how they'll learn. And if they don't get it, then they don't have the capacity for that. I think it's just about capturing their interest and recognizing all of those other pieces that we all talk about 24/7. Like, who is regulated when it's almost lunchtime and they're sitting at their desk and you've handed them a worksheet on a topic that has been in the textbook for 50 years? Like, that's not the way kids learn. So it's like if we really get them moving, get them seeing their letters, even thinking about like going back to those logos and stuff. I have a mom who recently told me she was like driving and her son's like, Chick-fil-A, Chick-fil-A. And she's like, Chick-fil-A? You want to go to Chick-fil-A? And she was like so shocked by that because she's like, he's never been to Chick-fil-A. Or maybe she had like offered to go there before and he wanted nothing to do with it. And she's like, so I realized like, oh, we were driving by one. She probably saw the sign. And I said, yes, because he's hyperlexic. So he can recognize the logo and read the words. And so she's like, okay, well, let's go. So they drove through and she's like, I didn't know if he would actually eat the chicken or anything, but I wanted to show him like, this is what Chick-fil-A is. And you've recognized the word. Now I want to give you like an experience to go along with this. And she's like, and he ate it and he liked it. And now we have like another place to add to the places that we can go. And so it's like sometimes that right there is a way to lean into teaching kids. It's like, it doesn't have to be so like, traditional. It can be like, yeah, Chick-fil-A. Like this is, like you said, going back to, I don't know why it's all coming together with your chicken example. They might see that CHI pattern elsewhere and be like, Chick-fil-A. Oh no, it's not, because look, it has this ending and that makes the word sound like this. And it's like, we could really lean into that as opposed to trying to fit their learning style into the boxes that we've already created.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of things, and I want to say, like, what an affirming experience that must have been for that kid to just be
right.
like, I get to actually go here. Now, I react the same way when I get to go to a Chick-fil-A because we don't have them here in Canada. So, well, I think there's some elsewhere, but not where I live. There isn't. Yeah, there's something else.
Yeah, I was so proud of her for making that turn and going into the drive-through, because what a great opportunity to to honor his communication, and then also to like lean into, because we had just been talking about the hyperlexia thing, and this mom is incredible too. She sees me writing on my iPad app, which is Procreate, which I'm sure there are others, but this is an app where you can draw, and I use it sometimes to write or to color with my clients. But I'll write words down there for him while we're playing, always in a playful way. I'm never going to write a word down and be like, what does this say? What does this say? Because I think that's another thing we do to kids. And they're like, I'm not doing that. But she saw us doing that one time. Next time he comes back, he has an Apple Pencil. He has an iPad. He has the app. So I'm like, this mom will do anything. So it's a lot of times comes down to the providers that are supporting these families and making sure that we are affirming and that we are giving them that reassurance. And even if it's not an iPad and an Apple Pencil, the boogie board or something, what is that? Like
it's called Boogie Board, and it's basically just a little like electronic type tablet where you can write on, and then with a press of a button, it just disappears.
Yes.
And they're not very big, and you can get them in different sizes, but yeah, it's like a whiteboard sort of, but
it's black, right?
Yeah. But like my son loves his. He's had his for like 10 years. He's chewed the pencil to bits, but like he still uses it, loves it. So I highly recommend that, like, especially if you don't have to, go the whole iPad route. And
exactly.
Everybody has a phone nowadays. Just use
Yes.
what you have on there to,
a piece of paper.
Anything, right?
If your child has an AAC device, please make sure they have access to a keyboard, because I find so many of my kids, or maybe they do have access to it, but no one's ever modeled use of it. And then when I do, they're like, this is the coolest thing ever. I don't even care about the icons on my app anymore. I'm just going to type. So sometimes they just need that exposure.
Yeah.
I was going to lead right into that. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say, just in my Facebook memories the other day, this picture came up, and it was when my son must have been about, I don't know, 3 or 4, we came across a really old BlackBerry that we had, and it has a full keyboard. So we gave it to him as just like on a whim. And the picture showed like just all these random words he had typed out. He thought it was the best thing ever. So just having access to that keyboard just like really opened, the door up to, what is he thinking about and all these things. Like it was just a random string of words, but
it shows you that like excitement factor plays. I was right when you said that, I was like, oh my gosh, you gave me the best idea, because I just bought this label maker.
Oh yeah.
I'm like, I'm going to be handing this over to my Hyperlexic kids this week and seeing like what they label, what they type on here. Because the satisfaction of typing a label and printing it and being like, yes, is for me as an adult who's not hyperlexic is like already through the roof. So I can just only imagine the kids coming in. They're going to be, I did it. I'm like, this was a great investment. I don't know what took me that long.
I'm so glad you made that connection, because I literally have a teletherapy client who I don't support anymore, but I helped parents discover that he was hyperlexic, that he was going to mainly communicate with them through typing. And then he got a hold of their label maker, and that's the only way that, at least when I was supporting him for like 6 months, the only way he communicated with them was through the label maker. But hey, whatever works.
Yeah.
Whatever works.
And honestly, something like a label maker is not only great for the communication side, but like you can use that to build on the comprehension skills and stuff
yes.
around the house, because you can go around and label things like, okay, here's step 1 is, put toothpaste. You can label the toothpaste with step 1 or whatever. Like there's so many things you could do with your drawing.
I am like, I genuinely feel like I am going to need medical attention, because my brain is like running a mile that's why I'm like, I don't know if anybody else will get anything from this podcast, but I know one person who's getting a lot from this podcast, and it's me.
No,
because every time we have somebody on here, I'm like, holy crap, why did I never think to do that? Like, I have this label maker here. All I'm doing is labeling my bin so that my ADHD brain can start putting things away, like, and respecting everybody else's space. But now I'm like, why am I not labeling everything? Like, let's go outside. Let's like,
right. Like even right on the fridge, you could have, a little script that's like, I'm thirsty.
I'm genuinely like,
right. Like there's so many possibilities. And that's what I mean. Like just write things down. Like it doesn't matter what form it takes. Like there are so many options out there. It doesn't have to just be, a sticky note. It can be a label maker, although the replacement things can be pretty expensive. I'm going to warn you now.
Yeah, it can be, but I'm also like, because why am I thinking of so many things? I'm like, I'll put on their water bottle, it could say like, I'm thirsty on their, whatever. I mean, gosh, that's such a cool idea. And it's just like, Yeah, this is so exciting for me.
Yeah.
I don't care about anybody else listening. Okay. I'm getting a major aha moment right now.
Well, and I think too, like teachers could use this in their classroom too. They could have some self-advocacy scripts or something right on the child's desk that like, I need
Mhm.
help or anything. Like there's so many possibilities.
I have one question for you.
Yeah.
Actually, can I ask two questions? The first question is going back to what you were saying, Katya, about the AAC system. I know that recently I've been kind of trying to start those conversations with parents of like, let's start supporting their literacy with that keyboard on their device. They love letters, they love this. Let's start typing things for them on their device and kind of going down that route. Because I think the reason that this came up recently was because there is a little guy who comes here who is really struggling with like handwriting, and yet he can read. So there is, part of me is thinking, does anybody really write anymore with their hand and a pen? I mean, to me, it would be much more affirming to this child to support the way that he's going to communicate, which may be with typing, than it would be to force him to handwrite something to prove that he can. Of course, I think that there are many reasons why handwriting is great. I'm not trying to say like don't teach your child to write, but do you have an opinion or any advice on what parents could do if your child is really like resistant to writing with a pen or a marker or anything like that, when it could be due to like a fine motor or a strength issue? Would you recommend typing as kind of the main modality for writing?
Absolutely. Why not? The other thing is just getting a whole bunch of alphabet magnets and just letting them spell out things that way too, right? Depending on obviously on the age of the kid, like are
Yeah.
we talking their 2-year-old and playing at home, or are we talking like maybe a 6 or 7-year-old who's at school? And I also think back to before I had children, I actually worked as a nanny for a family, and their son that I worked with in the classroom, he really struggled with handwriting skills. Like he just found it really tough. So he actually had, I don't know, this special like little keyboard thing that had just like it almost was like a giant label maker, but without the label that comes out. And he was able to use that in the classroom to be able to put his thoughts down on paper. And it made such a huge difference. So I'm like, why not lean into that? If it's easier for him, sure, then you can still keep working on building up maybe the strength or those fine motor skills so that one day he, might want to do handwriting. But like you also said, we live in an age where we probably don't write much, right? We type, we text, we use, emojis or whatever, right? So I
Right.
think it's important to explore that avenue and see if that does work.
I'm glad that you said that, because there are going to be kids who have other challenges that make writing really difficult or really non-preferred and maybe even aversive. And so it's like, rather than forcing a child to do something that's uncomfortable or really hard, why not give them a different modality? I love that idea of like that typing machine. I've definitely seen them. And the last question that I'm dying to know is, where does the title of your website come from? And next comes L.
Okay. So it's just kind of a running joke because my kids' names, my oldest, his name starts with a J. My next one starts with a K. So the joke was, well, the next one has to be L. So, and next comes L. But, my name is spelt unusual. So a lot of people, unfortunately, read my name as Dylan, not Diane, even though there's no L. So there's always been something about the letter L for some reason. And then, as I started writing about hyperlexia, I kind of joke that the L stands for letters, right? It's like, sure, you go have a baby and next comes the letters and then the reading. So yeah, it's just kind of a play on all of that.
Well, Diane, this has been so fun chatting with you. I'm so glad I got to speak with you face to face, because I've been following your stuff for years. But tell us about what resources you have out there right now for parents, professionals. Tell us what you have going on.
Yeah, for anyone who's interested in learning more about hyperlexia, I do have a free handbook on my website. And also, if you are wondering if hey, is my kid hyperlexic? Or maybe you're wondering, am I hyperlexic? I do have a free quiz that you can take to see if, there's enough traits to kind of tell you, yeah, this is maybe something you should explore. And then it'll give you some resources for your next steps.
That's great. I know that I've seen your free handbook, and that has been really helpful for a lot of my families. So definitely going to be recommending that quiz as well. People love a good quiz. So I really, I really like that. And we'll link that in the show notes. And where can everybody find you? What is your website, your social media handles? Tell us where we can find you.
Yeah, so you can check out my website at andnextcomesl.com, which I know just doesn't roll off the tongue very well, but and then you can also find me on Instagram at andnextcomesl.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure our listeners are going to come flocking over there. I know the parents of my clients will be, if they don't already follow you, because this is such an important topic and one that can really help them better understand their child. So thank you so much, Dyan, for being here. And yeah, this was great.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks.
I love